Reformation officially, so officially that we're actually going to start with the Apology to the Augsburg Confession. For those of you who are unfamiliar with your Reformation history, Martin Luther posts the theses, the 95 Theses to the door at Wittenberg. It causes a firestorm of debate in the Roman Catholic Church, the Western Church. This firestorm of debate gets so big that the emperor calls in his favors, he exercises his influence, and he brings everybody together to discuss this problem, this Martin Luther problem, this Reformation problem. And as they do, the Reformers prepare what is called the Augsburg Confession, the most foundational text to the Reformation, and the most, the word I'm thinking of is irenic text in the Reformation. By that I mean the text that most says, hey, we really do want to get along. We're not here to fight battles. We're looking to reform the church, to change the church and fix it, but not leave it. So the Augsburg Confession is written. The Reformers share this Augsburg Confession. They agree to this Augsburg Confession as this is what we believe. This is why we're protesting. This is what we're trying to reform about the church. And the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church and its magisterium, its leadership, write a confutation, the confutatio, a refutation of sorts, to the Reformers. We don't agree with everything in your Augsburg Confession. These are the points at which we're still in disagreement. Once that's been written, the Reformers write another text, the Apology to the Augsburg Confession. Apology here is not I'm sorry, it is a defense. It is the classic meaning of the word apology. It is saying this is what we meant, this is why we still mean it. We haven't changed our position, your confutation is still wrong, the things you have said are still problems in the church, and here's why. And not just here's why, here are the early church fathers who support our point. Here's all the evidence that what we are professing is not something new and novel and rebellious, but the common faith of the Christian church throughout all these years. So all of that to say, we're going to start with a brief portion of the Apology to the Augsburg Confession. And as we do, I'm throwing you in the deep end, but we're going to throw you in the... Here we go. Apology to the Augsburg Confession, Article 24, the Mass. At the outset, it is again necessary, by way of preface, to point out that we do not abolish the Mass, but rather we religiously retain and defend it. Among us, often than we do, and every festival, when the sacrament is made available to those who wish to partake of it, after they have been examined and absolved. We also keep traditional liturgical forms, such as the order of readings, prayers, vestments, and other similar things. All of this, they're saying, is unchanged. We're retaining as much of tradition, as much of... The opponents include a long harangue about the use of Latin in the Mass, in which they childishly quibble about how it benefits hearers who are ignorant of the Church's faith to hear a Mass that they do not understand. I said the Augsburg Confession was the irenic one. It was the peaceful, the olive branch. We're getting to the point where they're getting less and less irenic. They're calling their opponents what? Childish, right? This was not the beginning of the dialogue. Apparently, they imagine that the mere act of hearing itself is a useful act of worship, even where there is no understanding. We do not want to belabor this point, but we leave it to the judgment of the reader. So the Reformers say we're doing as much as we possibly can, but we've changed a couple things. What are they saying they have changed first and foremost here?
to be in Latin.
It's not going to be in Latin. It's not going to be in Latin. It will be in Germany, in German. In France, it would be in French. In England, it would be in English. In the vernacular language, yeah. In the local language, we say the Mass. Why? So that the average person can understand. So that everybody can understand. And this is the basic beginning of this argument.
Called transparency.
But as we hear this, what I just said, we're likely to skip past an important detail. This is not polemical language when they say that it benefits the hearers who are ignorant of the church's faith to hear a Mass that they don't understand. This is literally the way the Roman Catholic Church thought about the Mass. You don't need to understand it for it to be beneficial to you. Just come to church and we'll do all of the work. Come to church, hear what the priest is saying, even if you can't understand a word of it, and we'll do all of the work. This is the detail I don't want you to miss here. Takes us where the Reformers take us. And how we got here is important too. The goal of today is largely to help you understand the fact that the church got to a point where they thought, you literally don't even need to understand what's going on for it to matter to you. Whether you will or not, I don't know. I'm gonna do my best to get you there. But you only need to listen, right? You don't need to understand. That was a joke. Well, quick disclaimer, I hate doing this. I feel like I do it too often. I want to give a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in medieval church worship. I have studied medieval theology, a significant amount, more than your average pastor. But I'm not an expert in Roman Catholic theology of worship in the Middle Ages. I'm just not. Not many people are. And I say that in order to acknowledge that my presentation today is going to be a bit one-sided and biased. It simply is, I can't avoid it. I've done what research I can. But it's important for me to say this because a Roman Catholic disagreements with my presentation of the facts of history. They might have disagreements of my presentation of the way things looked. They might be right, but they might also just be representative of a grander problem in this dialogue, and that's that the position is not monolithic or permanent. It's not. It's developing, and it's even changing. And most Roman Catholics are comfortable with saying that, oh yeah, we've developed in theology since Jesus left and ascended into heaven. It's our job to do that, to respond to a changing world by changing ourselves. So if a Roman Catholic will nuance the things that the Reformers are saying, or even I will say today, that's normal. They're gonna say things differently than they used to. But it's probably not just that I'm misunderstanding. Part of the point of the Reformation was everyone is misunderstanding because of the way you're talking about it. We have to talk more carefully. And one of the biggest benefits of the Reformation is the Roman Catholic Church began to do that. Did they get it 100% right afterwards? I don't think so. To talk more carefully. Okay. As we think about how we got to this point, we talked last time about this way that piety was becoming more and more of an interior thing. And it's interior especially for the priests and the clergy. I'm going to live that out inside. We've got all kinds of prayers we talked about that they pray as they put on their vestments. I'm putting on this vestment and I'm praying this prayer. I'm putting on this vestment and I'm putting on this prayer. I'm putting on this piece of clothing and I'm praying this prayer. And these are all dictated to me. But it's all about my piety, the shape of my heart, the content of my heart and character. This is what I'm focusing on. Now, what does this leave outside the realm of importance? Your piety. The pastor has all of these things that he does, and everybody else has this question, okay, now what do we do? We also have an accumulation of drama and tradition, and in a sense, those prayers that I just mentioned are demonstrations of that fact. The traditions pile on top of each other, not just what we do in worship, but the prayers we say before and after, the kind of action. If you grabbed it on the way in, you have those 3 liturgies, and you see the way that the liturgy gets bigger and bigger. What people think is the bare minimum for a good worship service, a really faithful worship service, grows. Well, if we're not as high church as the church down the street, we're not good enough. If we're not doing what they do at the big church down the street, we're not good enough. We have to do better. We have to be more. Our live stream needs to have better cameras. We have to say longer readings from the scriptures. Our sermon needs to be longer. Oh, no, not that one. We need more songs from the choir. But yeah, these traditions accumulate, the expectations accumulate, and the drama of it all accumulates too, to the point where not only are the clothes that they're wearing more showy, the buildings that they're worshiping in are more showy, the actions they're doing are more showy as they elevate the host, and the choir sings this amazing song, and as they walk down the town, from the town square all the way to the church, everything becomes more dramatic. Drama of what's going on around them. Especially it is that what they're doing. We don't have movies and exciting YouTube videos to watch. We have church to go to on Sunday. And man, does church put on a good show. So all of this is accumulating, and it increasingly becomes more and more complex, more parts to move, more roles to fulfill, more work to be done by the church.
Can I ask you a question? Are
Yeah.
you talking about the Roman Catholic Church or also the growing Lutheranism, I guess, or whatever, the other churches?
Right now, we're back 300 years, and the Reformation has not started.
Okay, that's just trying to...
Yeah. All of this is going on in the Roman Catholic Church, and it's the backdrop to what brings Lutheranism in. In addition, we have some theological developments that are important, and I will do my best to say these quickly. First off, purgatory develops as an idea and eventually a full-blown doctrine of the church. If you want to look up a Bible passage that might help you begin to understand, go to 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul talks about you building on the foundation that is Christ with different elements. Some will have their works last to eternity, and others will be purged. They'll still be saved, but as through fire. Their works are going to burn up, so they're going to be refined. Purgatory is kind of an out. You have a question. What happens when you're a good believer? Your markers work and they don't disappoint you. That's what happens. And what happens when you're a bad believer? You believe Jesus Christ is your Lord, your Savior. You confess Him before men. You're a good Catholic. You go to church. You're saved. You go to heaven. But what happens for the bad believers, those who believe, who kind of go to church pretty well and mostly do what they're supposed to do? The Catholic Church recognizes that your salvation is not entirely dependent on your works. Let's brush that aside. These bad people are still saved, but they have to be parent. These people are doing the opposite. You might say demerit. So your life becomes this checkbook that you're balancing in a sense. You've got good works. These people have more bad works than good, and these people have more good works than bad. And if you end your life with more good works than bad, you go straight to heaven. And if you end your life with more bad works than good, you have to go through purgatory to be refined before you can be fully saved. Purgatory is not so much a location as it is an idea. I don't want to belabor that too much, but this idea develops over the course of church history, and it becomes kind of assumed, let's say, that everybody believes in it. Out of this concept of merits and demerits, we also develop a doctrine of indulgence. And in a Lutheran church, I'm not going to spend too much time on indulgences. But it develops out of the concept and practice of penance. When you do something wrong, if you're like Zacchaeus, return it fourfold, right? So you do something wrong, you return it. What does a person do who can't make amends for what they returned? If, say, you rape someone, let's go real far down the line. You can't fix that, right? What do you do in penance? How do you make right what you have done wrong? This becomes one of the biggest problems in the Roman Catholic Church.
Money?
Well, it starts off, and we kind of talked about this a little bit already when we were talking about apostasy. You start off with some extreme forms of penance. I'm going to fast 10, 20 years in order to make right what I have done wrong. But the church, in a pastoral move, feels like that's too much. And so they say, all right, that pastor who prescribed 20 years of fasting was going too far. Yes, rape is horrible, but we've got to find something that's more manageable for your average person. Because what if you did is going to despair because they look for ways to erase, to practice penance that are easier and easier and easier. If Joe down the street only had to do 3 weeks of fasting and you had to do a year of fasting and you both committed the same crime, you feel pretty bad, don't you? So they begin prescribing penances. The idea is you've got entire books called penitentiaries, books of this is the penance for stealing, this is the penance for breaking the Sabbath, this is the penance for lying, and the priest just knows when someone comes to confession and you're assigning penance, this is what you tell them to do. This practice makes penance kind of transactional, to be blunt. It becomes, I know I can commit this sin and not worry about it because the penance is easy. And note how broken that becomes when you can do that calculation. My son knows that he can break this rule because he doesn't mind but the Catholic Church is huge and it's hard to do that. And so one of the ways that they begin to allow a crusade, you go on a crusade and you get an indulgence, a plenary full indulgence for all of your sin. Then it becomes, if you donate to the basilica construction of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, you get an indulgence. My husband was a terrible sinner and a drunk. He didn't go to church, but I think he believed. And so I'm going to buy an indulgence for him to get him out of purgatory, to clear over his sin. But if you have a loved one Say it's not your husband, it's your son or your daughter. You begin to think, well, I guess I would do just about anything to save my son from immeasurable suffering. I'd do just about anything to save my daughter from immeasurable suffering, even if it's put myself into debt. And how the theology gets to be a little weird.
Well, and especially if you don't know the actual theology because it's in a language you don't understand.
Right.
You don't actually know what the...
Right. All the average person knows is what they heard of what's going on in church, but they know what happens when they go to confession, what their priest says, and I know I can get forgiveness for myself or for, like, you don't have even the ability to assess the validity of this statement for yourself because you don't have a Bible at home and you couldn't possibly afford one, right? Because Bibles are luxury goods that are made by hand. So all of this is the background to what we're talking about today. We have and the first place I want to go is the growing divide, which I've already kind of hinted at, between the religious people and the secular people. These are technical terms. When I say religious, we're talking about monks and nuns and friars and priests and bishops and cardinals and the Pope. Everybody who's dedicated to a life in the church is, quote unquote, religious. And the church has a separate category of the secular, the worldly person. The worldly person is not the non-Christian. So all of you are secular by this category, essentially, at least to my knowledge. All of you are secular using this categorization, and I am the only religious person in the room. In the church, in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Western Roman Catholic Church, the religious do most of the work. They do the work. But religious people do more and more work. The lay people become more and more observers, outsiders. Not only outsider in the sense that you have nothing that you can do for the good of the congregation beyond give offerings, but outsider in the sense that you don't understand what's being said as the service is being performed. You don't interact because you probably don't know the words to any of the responses that are being said by the choir. The choir is doing most of the responding in church, and you're kind of just standing there. Does all of this make sense? Like, you don't have to like it, but medieval piety creates a problem, and that's what in the world do these lay people do? What role do they have? Are they even necessary? So what did lay people do? They tried to maintain this good side of the good. They came occasionally to communion, and they came to church. Not often. They didn't come to communion often. It was a lot of work to go confess your sins to a priest and get absolved. But they did occasionally. They were required by canon law to come to church a certain number of times a year, to receive communion a certain number of times a year as well. And one of the first things that I want to look at as emblematic of all of this is the commissioning of what is called private masses. Let's see if this marker works a little better for us. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. Private masses became increasingly common in the Middle Ages. In the early church, as the reformers point out, it looks like private masses were practiced from time to time, but the church fathers tried to put them down, tried to prevent this from happening. But as this theology developed there's the religious and the secular, as the indulgence and purgatory theology developed, the reasons against something like a private mass became fewer and fewer, and the reasons thought process behind a private mass is much like that is about earning forgiveness for the living and for the dead. So it is itself a sign of indulgence or of piety. And while private masses originally were done by priests and the leadership of the church, it got to the point where people began commissioning them, paying. I feel particularly sinful and I am wealthy. I pay the church to commission, to perform a private mass on my behalf. I don't even have to go, but I pay the church to perform a private mass on my behalf so that they can earn forgiveness for me. Or if I've got like in the case of indulgence, I've got a family member who is particularly sinful, I can pay the church to perform a private mass for me. This practice is, I'll start here. Does this sound really foreign as I say it, like odd and strange? Like, even if you see the logic of it, like, to think like, man, that's nothing like piety today. How did we get here? A couple of ideas that are important to understand. First, it's that priests in the Roman Catholic Church are believed to be set apart with what they say is an indelible character. They've got this special indelible character. They're a different kind of human being because of their ordination, the laying on of hands and the authority of the priesthood. And their indelible character allows them to stand in the place of Christ when they administer the sacraments. They do, in general, stand in the place of Christ for the church, but they especially do when they're baptized. Lord's Supper is as if they are Christ himself. So, do them like Christ, but they are believed to, this is the word that's used, confer grace. They're believed to give grace simply by the performance of the rite itself. If you're really used to the Lutheran polemics here, you might recognize this term in Latin, ex opere operato. That the basic idea, and this is a big accusation of the reformers, is they treat the sacraments as if simply doing the work confers the grace. That the state of your heart doesn't matter. Simply doing the work will give you grace. So you can be a totally unrepentant sinner. You can be literally dead. This was doing private masses for the dead. You can be dead and unrepentant in your sins. And you can receive the grace simply by the performance of the work. It's not about the state of the conduct of your life. It's not about the state of your heart. You can receive the grace simply by the performance of the work itself. And finally, the Mass was seen as a re-sacrificing of Christ. This is the sacrifice of the Mass, as it's known. So how did we get able to, why did the church believe that the mere performance of the rite conferred grace? If you remember back a couple of weeks, you might know the answer, actually. What heresy led us to this conclusion? It was a heresy that we called Donatism. Anybody remember what Donatism is?
The holiness of the priest is what's necessary, and if they fall away, you have fallen away.
Yeah. So when you receive the Lord's Supper, Donatists believed that it was only valid if the priest was a good enough person, essentially. And if the priest fell away, all of the sacraments administered by that priest were invalidated. If the priest was proven to be a sinner, essentially, a grave sinner, then your baptism doesn't matter, the Lord's Supper that you celebrated didn't matter, it wasn't effective. And partially led by St. Augustine, this was many, many years ago, the church's position in response was, no, it's not the words said by the priest, because it's Jesus who authenticates this sacrament. It's Jesus who goes to the question of, when we're talking about a valid sacrament, Donatism goes in one direction, and it says that the character of the priests does not matter. But notice what's at question here. It's not the heart of the priest that's at question here in the Reformation and in this idea that private masses can be commissioned. It's the heart of the recipient. So Donatism says, so the church says in good news for all of you, right? But now the question the reformers are going to ask is your faith totally unnecessary? Your faith totally unnecessary for the sacrament's validity? Can you just give grace to your average person simply by performing a private mass for them? And the Roman Catholic Church, you don't have to agree, you just have to understand, wants to say yes. Why? Because they're one to doubt the efficacy of the sacraments. And the Lutherans, the Reformers, want to say, hey, hold on. We can't be administering masses. Understand how or why you're forgiven. What does the forgiveness even mean? If you don't even understand the person of Christ, what does your forgiveness, you're receiving a wafer and some wine even mean? Does this controversy begin to make sense? So this is, oh, and I didn't include the, I'm fairly certain this is still the Apology and still Article 24. But I failed to include the details here. I apologize. This is what the Reformers said. A sacrament is a ceremony or act in which God offers us the content of the promise joined to the ceremony. Thus, baptism is not an act which we offer to God, but one in which God baptizes, stands in the place of Christ. No, they're fine with that characterization. That when I baptize my child here in a couple months, I am doing so not myself, but I am doing it as God's representative. I'm standing in his place. And as baptized will be saved. By way of contrast, a sacrifice, so we're contrasting what? Sacrament and sacrifice. Nice little play on words there. A sacrifice is a ceremony or act which we render to God to honor him. So what's the contrast? Sacrament is God to us. Sacrifice is us to God. The Roman Catholics are talking about a sacrifice of the Mass. As the Apology is winding up, the basic argument, they're laying the groundwork for understanding a distinction between these two things. Here's what they say next. There are two, and only two, basic types of sacrifice. One is the propitiatory sacrifice. This is a work of satisfaction for guilt and punishment that reconciles God or placates his wrath or merits the forgiveness of sins for others. The other type of sacrifice is the Eucharistic sacrifice. This does not or show their gratitude for the forgiveness of sins and other blessings received. So a Eucharistic sacrifice or a... They've set us up to answer all of the questions in this short section. But Roman Catholics, the Reformers are saying, are viewing the sacrifice of the Mass, which is the Lord's Supper, as a propitiatory sacrifice, a sacrifice which obtains and confers the forgiveness of sins. And what are we saying it is instead? It is a Eucharistic sacrifice. What does this sacrifice do?
Those who have been reconciled give thanks or show their gratitude for the forgiveness of sins and other blessings received.
Right. It shows thanks. It shows gratitude to God for forgiveness that's been received. Eucharist means thanksgiving. It's a common word that we use for the Lord's Supper itself, right? Eucharist is a sacrifice, they say. Yes, we agree, it's a sacrifice, but it's not a propitiatory sacrifice. It is a sacrifice, just like the name implies. And Eucharist is not a Reformation-era term. This is the term that's used for the Lord's Supper for generations and generations. Eucharist, just like the name implies, is a sacrifice of thanksgiving, which itself is a category of sacrifice in the Old Testament. It's not propitiatory. What is the propitiatory sacrifice?
Crucifixion.
It's the crucifixion. It's Jesus' death on the cross that is the one propitiatory sacrifice in the Christian faith. They will say, constantly, the Reformers would say, yes, it does say it's a sacrifice, but it's not a sacrifice, which is to praise and honor and thank God for what he has done on the cross. It is done in remembrance, right? Do this as often as you eat it. This combines together to complicate the conversation. Because we have this tendency on one side where you have a growing divide between lay people and religious. You have the desire to attain indulgence and forgiveness for people and to be pastoral in doing so. You have the growing needs to combat heresy and to standardize the practice of the church. And you have a recognition that some people don't truly understand what's going on. You have this sense that it really doesn't matter that lay people understand if we are all doing the work for them. Like, my kids don't need to know the finances of the household. My kids don't need to understand how the water flows from the gutters out back behind the house. I'm doing all of that work for them. You have this parental, almost, role that the church is taking. And in a sense, dismissive too. All of this is on one side, while you have Reformers on the other saying, but it matters that they understand. It matters that the Lord's Supper is not supposed to be a propitiatory sacrifice. It is a sacrifice in the sense that it is Eucharistic. It's thanksgiving to God. It still confers forgiveness, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death. It confers forgiveness because it communicates this forgiveness to us. But it doesn't do it when you can't understand what's going on. It has to be taught. Faith has. All of this leads to another strange practice in the church, and that's communion in one kind. It became increasingly common for lay people to receive only the bread at communion. And I won't spend too much time on this because no one really agrees on why this started happening. No one really knows. There's lots of theories, and you'll hear lots of people who are talking about this give those theories. But the basic argument that justified this practice was, well, Christ is fully present in one kind. Why do we need to give them two? Are you going to divide the person of Christ and pretend that the bread that's given to the lay people is not sufficient for them? And that's a decent argument, but different here in the Western Church. And essentially, the Lutheran reformers, when they're talking about this in the confessions, seem to spec one more way to make clergy special and lay people less special. To drive home, you're not as good as us, you're not as special as we are. That's probably more polemical than it is the actual reason. And that you don't really need to come along for the ride. So there's another thing that grows out of this practice too, and we're running out of time real quick here. But it became customary in Western churches to reserve some of the bread after they would reserve the bread and then they would worship it. So you've got a little bit of Jesus in that box, right? And whenever you've got Jesus around, you should worship him, right? I'm not joking. There's no exaggeration. This is literally the thought process. And Roman Catholics still do this today. Eucharistic adoration is very, very seldom spoken against in Roman Catholic circles, and very often argued for. The reformers, initially this was just clergy and religious people who were doing this, but it became common for lay people as he was there. And I mentioned before the practice that happened sometimes, like yesterday, last time I talked about this, that lay people would try to steal the bread of communion and take it home with them. One of the reasons was this, we might say, in the body of Jesus, there's power in the presence of Jesus. And we want to tap into that any way we can. So if I get some Jesus to take home with me, I'll have easier access to him. In a world where access to Jesus is more and more and more and more difficult for lay people. In response of Holy Communion, yes, the Donatist controversy tells us that the validity of the sacrament is not dependent on the recipients. And then when he did, of you, drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. When Jesus commissioned the supper, this is how he did it. This is how he communicated it. And as we celebrate the supper, we should cling as closely. Came a central tenet of the Lutheran practice from then on. That one of the goals of our practice should be being as close to the practice of the original church as we can. Especially to the inspired words of the Holy Scriptures, which gave this practice to us. So yeah, it might be true that Jesus is fully present in the bread, but that's not, worshiping the bread of Holy Communion was not what Jesus gave us his body for. It was for us to eat, and so that's how we should use it. Is it appropriate to bow when the bread is consecrated and to bow when the wine is consecrated? Lutherans have been doing it from the beginning. That's appropriate. Jesus is there, and we're recognizing that fact. But is it appropriate then to save some of it for later? That's not what Jesus told us to do, so we're just not going to do it. All of that to say, and this slide, and this slide. The Book of Concord, which we have copies of in the back, you're welcome to grab one and take with you. We have suggested donations if you'd like to make a donation. Has lots on this, on everything that we've talked about today. Everything that the Lutherans, basically everything the Lutherans wrote and confessed for centuries to crystallize the points that I'm making today is here. This is the Augsburg Confession, the Apology. But if you'd like to get that later, come see me. For now, let's close with prayer. Your early church celebrated and the reformers defended the practice that Jesus had instituted. We know that our practice is in many regards probably not perfect, and our hearts and our lives are in many regards not perfect. But help us to cling as closely to your words as we possibly can. For in your words and in your promises are faith and life. Help us to hear and receive these words that you give and the promises that you give, not because we think that we have it all figured out, but out of simple trust in you, your presence, and send us out in the unity of faith that this sacrament stretches toward. Help us ever to be reformed by and recreated by the eating and drinking that you have so instituted in your body and your blood. And help us to reach out to those around us, that they might too believe in this act and